All right, welcome back to the deep dive. So today I want to start with a smell.
A smell. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, a very specific smell. You know that dusty, almost vanilla-scented musk you get from really old paper?
Oh, yeah. The used bookstore smell. Or an old library stack.
Exactly. Or like a box that's been sitting in your grandfather's attic since, I don't know, 1945.
Right. It's actually the smell of decomposition. It's the lignin in the paper breaking down.
The slow chemical suicide of cheap paper. That's a perfect description. And today, we're not just talking about the paper itself, but what was printed on it. We are diving deep into the world of the pulps.
And we could probably clarify right at the top, not the Tarantino movie.
Not the movie, though I have a feeling we'll circle back to it. No, we mean the actual physical magazines that basically flooded American newsstands for the first half of the 20th century.
Flooded is absolutely the right word. It's hard for us to grasp the scale now. We tend to think of the pulps as this kind of niche, retro aesthetic, you know? The guy in the fedora, the spaceman with the bubble helmet.
Right, it's a Halloween costume aesthetic.
Yeah, but in their prime in the 1930s, these things were moving tens of millions of copies every month.
Yeah.
They were, without a doubt, the primary way that most Americans consumed fiction.
And that brings us to the core premise of this deep dive, which is this amazing paradox. These magazines were, by design, trash.
Literally designed to be disposable.
They were printed on the absolute cheapest material they could find, sold for a dime, and you're supposed to read it on the train and then just leave it on the seat. Throw it away. And yet somehow this completely disposable medium accidentally invented the entire landscape of modern pop culture.
It's the ultimate trash to treasure story. And I don't think that's an exaggeration.
Yeah.
If you like Batman, if you're a fan of Star Wars, if you watch gritty HBO crime dramas, if you're into Lovecraftian horror, you are essentially enjoying the direct descendants of the pulp magazines.
They're the great-grandchildren.
The DNA is all there.
So that's our mission today. We're going to unpack that whole legacy. We'll look at the chemistry that gave them their name, the brutal economics that shaped their writing style, the explosion of genres that happened during their golden age.
And also the sociology of it. Why a country reeling from the Depression and Prohibition needed these specific kinds of heroes, these specific stories.
Exactly. But I think we should start where you suggested earlier. We have to define our terms. Because pulp isn't actually a genre, is it? It's a format.
It's a manufacturing process.
Yeah.
A physical object.
So if you're a reader in, say, 1925, you walk up to a newsstand, what are your choices?
Broadly, you have two. You can buy the slicks, which is what they call them, magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Collier's.
And they were called the slicks because?
Because they were printed on nice, glossy, smooth paper. It was chemically treated. Or for a fraction of the price, you could buy the pulps.
In that distinction, it all comes down to the wood, right?
It all comes down to the wood, and specifically this one organic polymer called lignin.
Okay, here comes the science bit.
It's pretty straightforward. Since the mid-1800s, paper was made from wood pulp, not cotton rags. But there are different ways to process that wood. For the slicks, they used a chemical process that cooked the pulp and removed the lignin.
And lignin is the stuff that makes wood stiff.
Exactly. It binds the cellulose fibers. But it's also the stuff that reacts with oxygen over time. It's what makes old newspapers turn yellow and get incredibly brittle. The slicks took it out.
The pulps, I'm guessing, left it in.
They left it all in. They used what's called ground wood paper. They basically just ground up logs, mixed the mush with water, and rolled it flat. It was the cheapest, fastest way to make paper.
So it was chemically unstable from day one.
Oh, highly acidic. It was actively destroying itself the moment it left the printing press. That's why collectors today have such a nightmare trying to preserve them. You look at a copy of Weird Tales from 1935 the wrong way, and it flakes into dust.
It was designed with a shelf life of what, a month?
If that. Just long enough to be on the newsstand until the next issue came out.
But that cost factor is the absolute key to this whole story. Because the paper was so cheap, the cover price could be kept at 10 cents. Maybe 25 for a thicker one.
And that price point changed American culture. You have to remember, before the pulps, fiction was largely a luxury for the upper and middle classes. A hardback book in 1920 might cost $2.
Which was a full day's wages for a lot of people back then.
Absolutely. The pulps were the first truly democratic mass media for fiction. The factory worker, the immigrant who was still learning English, the kid delivering newspapers, they could all afford a dime. It created this bottomless, insatiable hunger for stories.
And to feed that hunger, you needed a factory, an assembly line for narratives. Which brings us to the origin story. We have to go back to 1896 and a man named Frank Munsey.
Frank Munsey, a fascinating and not universally beloved figure in publishing.
He wasn't a literary man, was he? He was a numbers guy.
He was a businessman through and through. He owned a magazine called The Argosy. It started back in 1882, I think. It's sort of a general interest magazine for boys. You know, articles on how to build a kite, some uplifting stories, that kind of thing.
Wholesome content.
Very. And it was losing money, hand over fist.
So in 1896, he's basically on the verge of bankruptcy, and he makes a desperate pivot.
He makes a brilliant, ruthless pivot. He strips out everything that wasn't a story. No more articles, no photographs, zero educational value, just page after page of fiction. He bumped it up to 192 pages.
And printed it on that cheap, rough wood pulp paper to slash his costs.
That's the moment. He called it the Rough Paper Magazine. He'd essentially commoditized storytelling. He realized people didn't necessarily want to be educated or improved. They wanted to be distracted.
And did it work?
It exploded. Within a few years, the Argosy was selling 500,000 copies a month. Munsey became a millionaire. He proved the market existed, and an entire industry was born trying to copy his success.
Okay, so that decision created the pulp formula. You've got the cheap paper, which dictates the price, but you also have the cover. And we have to spend some time on the covers because the technology there was totally different from the inside, right?
Oh, completely. The inside was a wasteland. Just columns of cheap black ink on rough off-white paper. But the covers were printed separately on glossy stock using the four-color process. Publishers knew the cover was the only marketing tool they had.
You have to imagine the newsstand wars. You're walking down the street in New York in 1930, and there's a wall of hundreds of these things, all screaming for your dime.
So the art had to be aggressive. It had to be visceral. You had these incredible artists like Margaret Brundage for Weird Tales or Virgil Finlay for the sci-fi pulps, and they created these incredibly vivid, often lurid scenes.
Primary colors, right? Lots of reds and yellows.
Bright, clashing colors. And the subject matter was always at the peak of the action.
Yeah.
A woman in a torn dress fainting, a hero firing 2 guns at once, a giant tentacle monster wrapping around a spaceship.
It was analog clickbait.
It was 100% analog clickbait. The cover often had, shall we say, a tenuous relationship with the actual story inside.
Huh. So you'd see a giant squid on the cover, and the story would just be about a guy finding a weird fish.
Pretty much. But it didn't matter. It got you to pick it up. It got you to part with your dime. The mission was accomplished.
Okay, so that's the packaging. Let's talk about the product itself, the writing. Because the economics of the paper didn't just determine the price, it determined the prose style, didn't it?
Absolutely. This comes down to the infamous penny-a-word rate. Most pulp writers, especially starting out, were paid between 1 and 3 cents per word.
Which sounds just abysmal.
It sounds terrible, but you have to adjust for inflation. In 1925, if you were a fast and prolific writer, you could actually make a decent living. Some of the top guys made more.
But the key is fast and prolific. You had to churn out pages.
You had to be a machine. And this is where the pulp style comes from. Think about it. If you're writing for a prestigious literary magazine, you might spend an entire afternoon agonizing over the perfect adjective to describe a sunset.
Right.
If you're writing for spicy detective stories and you need to pay your rent by Friday, you do not have time for the sunset. You need the character to punch someone, open a door, or fire a gun.
Because action equals word count.
Action equals momentum and word count. The editors were ruthless. They didn't want long descriptive passages or deep psychological introspection. They wanted page turners. They called it yarn. They wanted stories that grabbed the reader in the very first paragraph and just did not let go until the final line.
So it's a stripped-down, verb-heavy style, plot over everything else.
Plot, movement, excitement, minimal character development, minimal flowery prose. It became the hallmark of a certain kind of American fiction.
You know, it's funny. It's basically the Hemingway style, but applied to genre fiction instead of literary fiction.
You could argue Hemingway was influenced by the same currents. It's that distinctly American voice, direct, punchy, unpretentious, show, don't tell, wasn't an artistic choice, it was an economic necessity.
Okay, so we've established the format. The cheap paper, the lurid covers, the fast-paced writing. Now I want to get into the golden age.
Yeah.
This is roughly the 1920s through the 1930s. The industry matures, and instead of just these general adventure magazines like the Argosy, we start to see specialization.
The segmentation of the market, which is where it gets really fun, because each of these genres developed its own unique culture, its own stable of star writers, and its own philosophy.
A perfect place to start, then, is in the shadowy back alleys. the detective pulps.
And if you only remember one magazine title from this entire deep dive, it should be Black Mask
Black Mask, founded in 1920.
by, of all people, H.L. Mencken and George Jean Nathan, the great literary critics. They started it mostly as a way to make some quick cash to fund their more serious literary magazine, The Smart Set.
So it was a side hustle for them.
It was a total side hustle. But under a later editor, a man named Joseph Capshaw, it became legendary. It changed everything.
Because before Black Mask, detective fiction was very British, right? Very Sherlock Holmes, the cozy mystery.
Exactly. The gentleman sleuth. The murder happens at a locked room in a country manor. The detective is a brilliant but quirky eccentric, and the whole thing is basically a logic puzzle. The violence is clean. It happens off screen.
And Black Mask just threw all of that out the window.
Threw it out, ran it over with a truck, and dropped it in the bay. Shaw wanted stories about real American crime, gritty, cynical, violent stories.
And this is where Dashiell Hammett comes in.
Hammett is the key that unlocks the whole genre. He had actually been a private detective for the Pinkerton Agency. He'd done the work. He knew that real crime wasn't about a missing Duke's ruby. It was about grift, corruption, blackmail, and just ugly violence.
So he wrote what he knew.
He wrote what he knew. He created the Continental Op, this short, fat, unnamed, and deeply cynical operative who solved crimes, not with brilliant deductions, but by stirring up trouble and seeing who reacted. He'd just wade into the muck.
This is the birth of the hard-boiled detective.
Yeah, this is it. And it wasn't just a style, it was a worldview, a philosophy. The hard-boiled detective lives in a world that is fundamentally corrupt. The cops are on the take, the politicians are crooked, the rich are untouchable, the system is broken.
So the detective isn't a knight in shining armor.
Not at all. He's just a guy trying to do a job who has his own personal, often battered code of honor. He might not save the world, but he'll see his case through to the end.
And you can draw a perfectly straight line from Hammett to Raymond Chandler, who also got his start in Black Mask.
And from Chandler to every film noir movie ever made. The Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep, these iconic works of American literature started as serialized stories in a 10-cent disposable magazine.
Chandler, in particular, really elevated the style, didn't he? He added a kind of cynical poetry to it.
He did. He famously said, Hammett took murder out of the Venetian vase and dropped it into the alley.
I love that quote. That feels like the entire ethos of the pulps in one sentence.
It is. Taking the pretension out of art and putting it back on the streets where people actually lived.
Okay, let's pivot. From the back alley to the stratosphere, let's talk science fiction.
My personal favorite rabbit hole. Science fiction, as we know it, has a distinct marketing category. Basically starts in the pulps. And you have to start with Hugo Gernsback.
The man the Hugo Awards are named after.
The very same. He launched Amazing Stories in 1926. Now, Gernsback was an inventor. He was a radio enthusiast. He had this very particular vision. He called the genre scientifiction.
Scientifiction. A bit of a mouthful.
A bit, yeah. His goal was actually kind of educational. He wanted adventure stories that would, along the way, explain how radio waves worked, or the principles of electricity, or the physics of rocketry.
So these were the gadget stories.
They were very, very gadget-heavy. Look at this amazing ray gun. Let me explain for 3 pages how it focuses light. The writing itself, well, let's be charitable and say it was often secondary to the ideas. It could be pretty clunky.
But then comes the evolution. The pivot point for the genre.
The pivot point is a man named John W. Campbell. He takes over the editorship of a magazine called Astounding Science Fiction in the late 1930s. And Campbell is, arguably, the single most important editor in the entire history of science fiction.
So what did he do differently?
He fundamentally changed the question. He told his writers, I don't care about the amazing machine. I care about how the amazing machine affects the people who use it.
Wow, that is a massive shift. That's the move from being a tech demo to being about sociology or psychology.
Exactly. He wanted stories about the human consequences of technology. He demanded better writing, better characterization, and he discovered, or at least nurtured, this incredible roster of talent. Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Iggy Van Vogt, Theodore Sturgeon. The giants.
And he would give them story ideas, wouldn't he?
He was very hands-on. He famously gave Asimov the prompt for the story, Nightfall, which is a classic. He said, imagine a planet with 6 suns, so it's never dark. What happens to that civilization on the one day every 2,000 years when all the suns set at once and they see the stars for the first time?
That's not a technological question. That's a psychological one, a sociological one.
That's the Campbell Revolution. And that's why this period is called the Golden Age of science fiction. These writers weren't just predicting wrist radios, they were debating the ethics of AI, they were exploring fascism versus libertarianism in interstellar empires. They were using the future as a laboratory to examine the present.
It's just incredible to think that while all the mainstream literary critics were completely ignoring them, these guys in these cheap magazines were effectively drafting the blueprint for the entire atomic age, the space age.
They really were. There's a famous, possibly apocryphal story that the FBI raided the offices of Astounding during World War II.
Wait, seriously, why?
Because a writer named Cleve Cartmill published a story called Deadline in 1944 that described the mechanics of an atomic bomb with such startling accuracy that the government thought there must have been a leak from the Manhattan Project.
No way.
Campbell had to sit them down and explain that, no, they had just extrapolated it all from articles that were publicly available in physics journals before the war. But that shows you how on the pulse they were. They were thinking about this stuff years ahead of everyone else.
Okay, let's move to a different, much darker corner of the newsstand. The section that parents were probably most worried about their kids seeing? Horror. And specifically, one magazine, Weird Tales.
The unique magazine, as it billed itself. And it really was. Weird Tales debuted in 1923. It never had the massive circulation of, say, the Western or detective pulps, but its cultural impact was. I mean, it was nuclear.
Because this is the home of the Lovecraft Circle.
This is the home. H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith. They were known as the Three Musketeers of Weird Tales. They corresponded constantly, they influenced each other, and they were writing a kind of horror that was fundamentally new.
Before this, horror was mostly, what? Ghosts, vampires, Gothic castles.
Pretty much the ghost story. Lovecraft introduced what we now call cosmic horror.
The idea that the universe isn't good or evil, it's just completely and utterly indifferent to us.
Exactly. And that humanity is a tiny, insignificant speck in a vast, cold, and terrifying cosmos, inhabited by ancient alien entities that would barely even notice us as they crushed us. It was a deeply bleak, atheistic, materialistic view of the universe that really resonated with the post-WWI generation that had seen God die in the trenches.
And then you have his pen pal, Robert E. Howard from Texas.
Howard took Lovecraft's bleak universe and came to a totally different conclusion. If the universe is meaningless and the gods are dead or monstrous, then the only thing that matters is individual strength, the will to live, the will to fight.
And from that philosophy, we get Conan the Barbarian.
We get Conan. And Conan is not a hero in our modern sense. He's a thief, he's a mercenary, a pirate, a killer. He's a survivor. He represents this raw, vital, barbaric energy that Howard felt civilization was trying to crush.
While we're in this dark corner, I want to touch on an even darker subgenre, the Shudder pulps.
Oh, yes. The weird menace genre. Magazines like terror tales, horror stories, spicy mystery stories.
Now, these are very different from the philosophical horror of Lovecraft, right?
Oh, worlds apart. Lovecraft's horror was intellectual. The Shudder pulps were visceral and deeply misogynistic. The covers were almost exclusively about torture. A woman, usually in torn clothing, being whipped or branded or threatened by some kind of deformed madman.
And the stories followed a formula.
A very rigid formula. A young, innocent woman, and usually her boyfriend gets stranded somewhere. They're captured by a mad scientist or a bizarre cult. There are pages and pages of elaborate, sadistic torture. But, and this is the weird twist, at the very end, it's always revealed that it wasn't supernatural at all.
It was just a guy in a mask.
It was just a guy in a mask trying to scare them away from the old sawmill so he could get the inheritance. It's basically Scooby-Doo, but for a deeply disturbed adult audience.
It's where the trash label for the pulps really, really sticks.
It does. These magazines were deeply controversial even at the time. They were the main target for censorship campaigns.
Which brings us neatly to the spicy pulps. I feel like we can't talk about this era without addressing the soft-core elephant in the room.
Spicy detective, spicy western, spicy adventure. They were all published by a guy named Harry Donenfeld, who, in a beautiful twist of irony, would later go on to own DC Comics.
So the guy who published Superman also published this stuff. That's amazing.
The irony is delicious.
Yeah.
The spicy pulps were the erotica of the day. But this was the 1930s, so they had to be incredibly careful because of censorship laws. There was a lot of innuendo, a lot of ellipses, a lot of euphemism.
Her bosom heaved with passion.
There was a lot of heaving. But here's an interesting nuance that often gets missed. Paradoxically, the female characters in the spicy pulps often had more agency than the damsels in distress in the mainstream adventure pulps.
Really? How so?
Well, in a standard adventure story, the girl is often just the prize to be won. But in the spicy stories, because the plot revolved around sexual tension and danger, the women were often active participants. They were undercover agents, or femme fatales playing their own game, or adventurers who were just as tough as the men. It's a very weird contradiction. The covers were purely exploitative, but the stories inside could sometimes be surprisingly, well, not feminist, but they featured strong characters.
Okay, I want to zoom out for a minute. We've covered the detectives, the robots, the barbarians. I want to spend some time on the why. Why did the American public need these stories? Why did they inhale 20 million of these magazines a month?
You have to look at the historical timeline. The golden age of the pulps aligns almost perfectly with two of the biggest national traumas in American history, Prohibition and the Great Depression.
Okay, let's take Prohibition first. The 1920s. The Roaring '20s.
It wasn't just that you couldn't legally buy a beer. It was the fact that the law created the rise of organized crime on a scale never seen before. Americans were watching in real time as the mafia basically took over entire cities. And they saw that the police were either completely outgunned or, worse, on the payroll.
The social contract felt like it was broken.
Completely shattered. And when the law fails, people fantasize about justice outside the law. And this is the moment the hero pulp is born.
Characters like the Shadow, the Spider, the Green Hornet.
The Shadow is the absolute archetype. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. And he didn't arrest people. He didn't hand them over to the corrupt police. He terrified them. He hunted them. He often gunned them down in cold blood.
He had the power to cloud men's minds.
He was this supernatural, terrifying force for justice. He is a direct, unfiltered response to the feeling of powerlessness that everyday people had in the face of the mob. He's a wish fulfillment fantasy, a benevolent fascist, essentially, who imposes order through superior violence and intellect.
It's the ultimate vigilante fantasy. If the system won't protect me, this mysterious guy in a black cape and a slouch hat will.
And it's no accident that most of these heroes were secretly wealthy playboys. The Shadow was Lamont Cranston, a man about town. The Spider was Richard Wentworth. It's the idea of the good elite, the righteous rich man, using his resources to protect the common folk when the government can't. A blueprint Batman would later follow perfectly.
Okay, but then comes the crash, 1929. The Roaring '20s end with a whimper, and the Great Depression begins. The anxiety shifts.
The anxiety shifts dramatically. It's not just about crime in the streets anymore. It's about fundamental survival. It's about impotence. You have millions of men who had been the proud providers for their families who are now suddenly useless. They couldn't find a job. They couldn't feed their kids. The entire system of American capitalism had failed them.
So what's the fantasy solution for that kind of anxiety?
Competence. Absolute, total, unwavering hypercompetence. And into that void steps Doc Savage.
Clark Savage Jr., the Man of Bronze.
Doc Savage is one of those important characters in this entire story. He wasn't just strong. He was the world's greatest surgeon, the world's greatest scientist, a master of disguise, a brilliant musician and inventor. His father had trained him from birth, physically and mentally, to be the perfect human being.
He's the ultimate life hacker before that was a term.
He is. He represents total control in a world that felt completely out of control. Reading a Doc Savage story was a way to feel capable by proxy. If you're a guy standing in a bread line, feeling worthless, reading about a man who could solve literally any problem with his brain and his fists, that was an incredibly powerful and soothing fantasy.
It's competence porn.
It is 100% competence porn. And on the flip side of that coin, you had the raw escapism of characters like Tarzan or Conan. Their message was different.
If Doc Savage is about mastering the modern world,
Tarzan and Conan are about rejecting it entirely. Their message is, if civilization is failing, if the banks are closing and the factories are shutting down, then civilization itself is the problem. The fantasy becomes, I don't need society. I can survive in the jungle. I can thrive in the wilderness with just my wits and my muscles.
it's a rejection of the failed modern world.
It's the primal scream. So you have these two powerful competing fantasies, both born from the Depression. The hypermodern competence of Doc Savage and the pre-modern savage strength of Conan.
So the pulps were serving this vital psychological function. They weren't just entertainment. They were the nation's therapist processing its traumas. But then the therapy session ended, which brings us to the decline and fall.
It's a tragedy in 3 acts. Act 1 is World War II.
We talked about the cheap paper at the beginning. I have to assume a global war really messed up the supply chain for wood pulp.
Massively. The government started rationing paper. Wood pulp was essential for the war effort, for making nitrates, for explosives, for packaging supplies. So there were strict limits placed on how much paper magazines could use. They had to shrink the size, lower the page count,
Why,
print fewer copies.
And what about the talent? The writers and artists?
A huge talent train.
Yeah.
You had guys like L. Ron Hubbard, who was a massive pulp writer before he, founded a religion.
Right.
Him, Robert Heinlein, countless others, they all went into the service.
Yeah.
But beyond the logistics, there was a shift in the public mood.
How so?
When you're fighting real-life Nazis, the melodramatic, cackling villains of the hero pulps start to look a little silly, a little trivial. The shadow fighting a mad scientist with a death ray just doesn't hit the same when you're reading newspaper headlines about Iwo Jima or the Holocaust.
The real world became more horrifying than anything in Weird Tales.
Exactly. And the soldiers who came home in 1945 wanted something different. This brings us to Act 2 of the tragedy, the paperback revolution.
Pocketbooks.
Pocketbooks. In 1939, they started selling paperback reprints of actual novels for 25 cents. They were small, they were designed to fit in a soldier's cargo pocket, and they were much more durable than a floppy pulp magazine.
They completely ate the pulp's lunch.
They devoured it. The value proposition was just unbeatable. Why buy a pulp magazine with maybe 5 so-so stories just to get the one good one, when for just a little more money you could buy a complete classic novel by Hemingway or Agatha Christie or a Dashiell Hammett?
Right. The digest-sized magazines hung on for a bit longer.
They did. Things like Reader's Digest or Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, but that big 7 by 10-inch rough paper pulp format was on its deathbed.
And then comes Act 3, the final boss, television.
The serial killer. And I mean that literally. The business model of the pulps relied on serialization. The cliffhanger ending that forced you to buy the next issue to see what happens. TV gave you that every single week, for free, delivered right into your living room.
All the pulp heroes started migrating to other media.
They did. The Lone Ranger moved to radio and then to TV. Superman was already a star in comics and on the radio. The visual excitement that the pulp covers had promised for decades was now being delivered in motion on a screen.
And the industry just collapses. The last true pulp magazine, I think it was 15 Western Tales, published its final issue in 1957.
And that was it. The newsstand changed forever. It became the world we know today. Glossy magazines and racks of paperbacks. The rough paper era was officially over.
But, and this is the big finale, the whole point in this deep dive, it wasn't really over. Because the pulps didn't die, they just transmuted. They uploaded their consciousness into the rest of pop culture.
The genetic material of the pulps is in everything we consume today. Everything.
Okay, let's trace some of those lineages. Let's start with the most obvious one. Superheroes.
It's a direct one-to-one descent. Batman is the Shadow, with a better costume and a tragic backstory. Superman is Doc Savage, but with alien DNA to explain his powers instead of intense training.
He's the Man of Steel, Doc was the Man of Bronze. It's right there.
It's right there. The entire logic of the superhero genre, the secret identity, the colorful sidekicks, the larger-than-life supervillains, the secret base of operations, all of that was codified and perfected in the hero pulps of the 1930s.
Marvel and DC Comics basically just added pictures to pulp story formulas.
Stan Lee and Jack Kirby grew up reading this stuff. They weren't hiding it. The Thing from the Fantastic Four, his gruff, tough guy personality, is pure pulp adventure characterization.
Okay, what about the big screen, Star Wars?
Oh, George Lucas has been very open about this. Star Wars was his deliberate attempt to recreate the feeling of watching the old Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers movie serials from his childhood.
Which were based on the pulps.
Han Solo is a classic pulp archetype. The cynical, gun-slinging smuggler with a hidden heart of gold. The entire pacing of Star Wars, that breathless, relentless, out of the frying pan into the fire structure. That is the pulp formula writ large across the galaxy.
Same with Indiana Jones.
100%. He's a pulp adventure hero. He's Alan Quatermain with a college degree.
And what about that hard-boiled writing style, the Kenny-a-word cadence that came out of Black Mask?
It became the default voice for American crime fiction. You can't imagine Elmore Leonard, James Ellroy, Michael Connelly. None of them exist without the foundation laid by Hammett and Chandler.
Even the business structure of modern media feels pulp-like. The whole concept of the cinematic universe.
Oh, absolutely. The pulps pioneered the crossover event. They were building shared worlds long before Marvel. You'd have characters from one hero pulp showing up in another one's magazine. It was a marketing gimmick to get readers to buy more titles. The MCU is just pulp serialization with a $2 billion budget.
It's funny to think about the collectors now, the people who hunt down these trash magazines.
It is the ultimate irony, isn't it? A copy of All Story magazine from October 1912, the one that has the first appearance of Tarzan. A good copy of that will cost you tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more.
A magazine that was printed on paper designed to literally rot away.
The value comes from the scarcity. Because they were trash, everybody threw them away. It's the same reason first-issue comics are so valuable. My grandmother threw away my dad's comics. His grandmother threw away his grandfather's pulps. It's the great circle of cultural life.
But beyond the monetary value, they're incredible historical documents.
They're a time capsule. If you want to know what the unvarnished racial prejudices of 1925 were, read a pulp magazine. It is right there on the page. If you want to understand the anxieties people had about new technology, about immigration, about the economy, read the pulps.
They are the subconscious of the 20th century.
They're the id of America. Messy, problematic, violent, thrilling, and absolutely full of dreams.
So we've come full circle. From the wood chipper to the multiplex, we've seen how cheap paper and economic desperation accidentally birthed our entire modern mythology.
And I think we've learned that cheap definitely does not mean worthless.
Which brings us to our final thought. We always like to leave you with a question to chew on.
So here's what I've been thinking about. We look back at the pulps now with a certain nostalgia. We see them as art, or at least as classic Americana. But at the time, the cultural gatekeepers, the librarians, the teachers, the literary critics, they despised this stuff. They called it gutter literature.
They were convinced it was rotting kids' brains. The moral panic of its day.
Exactly. So my question for you is this. What is the pulp fiction of today? What is the medium that exists right now that the serious people, the critics, dismiss as trash, as lowbrow, as a complete waste of time? But that is actually incubating the next great generation of storytellers and the next big genres.
Oh, that's a great question. My first thought is fan fiction.
It's a great candidate. It has the same massive volume, millions upon millions of words written for passion, not profit, or maybe for small donations on Patreon. It's largely ignored or looked down upon by the literary establishment. And yet, 50 Shades of Grey started as Twilight fanfic. It's already breaking through.
What about video games? Or not just the games themselves, but the lore? The storytelling that happens in these vast online worlds.
Or even something like creepypasta, the collaborative horror storytelling that happens on the internet. The Slender Man, the Backrooms wiki, that feels incredibly Lovecraftian, a kind of crowdsourced modern cosmic horror.
Or, and this might be a stretch, maybe it's TikTok, the strict constraints of the 60-second video are just the modern version of the penny a word rate. It forces a new kind of economic, visual creativity.
I think that's a fantastic point. The medium dictates the message. And somewhere on a server right now, the next Dashiell Hammett is probably writing something in a format that we would just roll our eyes at, but that our grandkids will end up studying in college.
A very humbling thought. So the next time you see someone mindlessly scrolling through what you think is trash on their phone, maybe show a little respect. You might just be witnessing the birth of a genre.
Or at the very least, the next Star Wars.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you on the next one.